Good morning and welcome to the first part of this two-part series on building a IT request application from scratch in LittleHorse. So in the first part of this series, we're going to be making a workflow that handles IT requests using a notification task that was pre-built, and we're going to run the workflow using the command line and inspect it on the dashboard. In the second part of this tutorial, we're going to build a REST API, which allows us to manage our approval instances and run the workflows via HTTP requests rather than through the command line only. So as always, I'm going to start with the terminal. I'll move this over here. And I have already created a folder called email worker, and I'll show you what's inside of here. What's inside of here is a LittleHorse task worker, which is capable of sending emails as a task with the name send email. So this code will be provided in the video description on a GitHub link. But essentially, what we're trying to simulate here is if you're in a larger organization, you might have different teams who are in charge of different microservices, and maybe you have a microservice that sends emails to your customers or sends emails to internal users, or perhaps sends push notifications or something like that. You can use your imagination. And what is important to look at here is this Java method is very generic, and it basically sends an email to any address with any content. And we have annotated it with this LH task method annotation. So now it becomes a LittleHorse task. So as a prerequisite to this video, hopefully you've gone through our quick start and you're generally familiar with how workflows work in LittleHorse and what a task worker does. So that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but let's just get started and get the environment set up. So the first thing I'm going to do is run the LittleHorse standalone Docker image, which allows us to have a LittleHorse server and dashboard running locally in my terminal. And it'll take probably 20, 30 seconds to start up because we have to start up Kafka first. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a directory for this application. I'm going to call it IT request workflow. And then since we're using Java, we're going to run Gradle init. I mean, application in Java. And beyond this, we'll just select all the default options. Okay. Next thing to do is open up the Gradle project that we just generated and add the LittleHorse client as a dependency. So I think testing will be beyond the scope of this application because we're trying to make this video short. So we're just going to quickly add the LittleHorse client. Okay, and then we can remove this test directory that was auto-generated. Tests can be the subject of another video. So now let's see if we are able to properly download the LittleHorse client. And it seems that Gradle build is happy. So now we just need to refresh the VS Code workspace and we should have access to LittleHorse code. So let's take a look at, let's think about this workflow for a second while LittleHorse is coming up. What the workflow is going to look like is something like this. So the first step is one, the workflow starts when a user /employee submits a request for IT, contains an item and a justification. Why do they need that item? Second is we need the finance team to approve it. And this in LittleHorse is going to be a user task. And I'll put a link to the user task concept documentation inside the README of the code that ends up on GitHub in the video description. And then depending on whether or not the request was ejected or approved, you notify the user/employee whether their request was accepted. So how does this work? This is going to be a task, and we're going to use LittleHorse conditionals after the user task based on the results of the user task to construct to route the workflow to a task that will either simulate approving or rejecting this IT request. In real world, you'd probably have a couple other steps. Maybe you'd automatically fulfill the request as a task, but we're just going to keep it simple here and try to minimize what's going on. So what LittleHorse metadata are we going to need? We're going to need one user task definition, which is this approve IT request thing, and then we're going to need a way to notify the customers. So user task definition, approve IT request. This needs to be a form that basically has a Boolean, which is whether or not the request was approved. And then we're going to need a task def called send email, which sends an email and notifies the person whether or not it was approved. So I mentioned earlier we had that other task definition that was pre-built. So I'm going to first verify that LittleHorse is running. And when it's running, then we're going to register the task definition. So run the LHCTL version command. I see that we are on version 0.10, and the client and the server are able to talk to each other, which is great. So now let's go to the dashboard. We can see there's no workflows, no task definitions, no user tasks, no external event defs, nothing, empty. That makes sense. So let's go back to the terminal and we'll go to the email worker and we're going to Gradle run. And this code, you can take a look at how this works later. But basically what I have done is I have created a send email task definition, which takes in a to address, a subject, and a body as the 3 parameters. And now the task worker is polling, waiting for tasks to execute. So I'm going to leave this over here in a terminal, open up another terminal, and go to the IT request workflow repository, which is or directory, which is the Gradle project that we just started. So now if I go back to the dashboard, you'll see that we have a send email task definition right here, which has those 3 input variables that we just talked about. So great, we have solved the problem of getting access to a task definition, and we have a task worker ready to execute it. But before we can actually write the workflow, we still need to create the user task definition. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's create a user task form object. And LittleHorse has a bunch of utilities for creating user task definitions. Chief among them being the user task schema and user task field annotation. So we're going to create an IT request approval form, and it's going to have 2 fields. So the comments are going to be any comments of the reviewer, of maybe an explanation of why they rejected the request, but this is optional, right? So we're going to annotate it with user task field required equals false, and description is going to be any why did you reject? Why did you reject or approve it? And then the second thing is going to be is approved. And this is required. And because it can only have 2 values, it's going to be Boolean. So basically, if you look at this Java object, it has 2 fields, comments and is approved. When we have a user task executed in a workflow, the output of that user task node is going to be a JSON object with these 2 fields in it. And we're going to use those 2 fields as part of our workflow later on. So what we want to do first, before we do anything else, is we want to create the user task definition. So let's create a LittleHorse client. So I've created the configuration using the default environment variables, using the environment variables. And right now I don't have my defaults overridden, so it's going to point to the localhost server. In production, what you would do is you would probably deploy this on Kubernetes or in ECS, ECS, or some other system, and you'd put some environment variables in, or perhaps give it a properties file that configures your client to talk to a LittleHorse cloud cluster, or perhaps LittleHorse open source running in your Kubernetes environment or something like that. So now let's get a client. So you notice it's a blocking stub. That's because in Java gRPC, there are blocking and async gRPC clients. We want the blocking one so that we can make things synchronous. And next thing, what we need to do is we need to create a schema to create a put user task def request that will give us a user task def that defines this exact user task. So we're going to use the Java user task schema utility method. And we need to give it an object, which is an instance of the IT request approval form. And the name of the user task is going to be approve IT request. So now, put user task def request the put user task def request can be generated from the schema with the compile method. And the last thing that we have to do is client.put user task def with that request. And we'll print out the result of that. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to run Gradle run. And we should see a user task proto object printed out. Great. So here is a protocol buffer printed out, and we can see when it was created. We can see the fields, and we should be able to go back to the dashboard, take a look. Oh, what do you know? Here's the user task definition. And we see our two fields. Why did you reject or approve it? True if the request is approved. This one is required. And we don't actually see any user task runs because we haven't actually run it yet. Okay, so before we can continue any further with actually running the workflow, we need to define the workflow specification. Why is that? Well, we go back here, we don't see any workflow, so you can't actually run it. So we can't use our lovely task definition or our user task definition that we just created. So let's create a class called IT request workflow. I know this is very fancy. Colt's not doing everything in just one Java file. I think I'm a good engineer, but my team says I write dirty code. Okay, so this class is going to take in as a dependency a LittleHorse client because it's going to register a workflow. So it'll have a private member variable called the client, and it'll take it in the constructor. Oh. Okay, so we're going to create a register workflow method, which when you create an IT request workflow and you call that register workflow spec method on it, it will register the workflow specification in LittleHorse. And we're going to call it to do for now. Before we can do that, we need to create a method on the IT request workflow class that we can use with the LittleHorse SDK using the LittleHorse domain-specific language for creating a workflow specification. And we're just going to call that workflow logic. And the important thing about workflow methods in LittleHorse is that they take in a workflow thread object, which is the handle that allows us to use this somewhat fluent domain-specific language to build workflows. I'm going to call it workflow, or WF. I don't like typing very much. Okay, so now we are prepared, to do write the workflow logic in here. Now we are prepared to actually do the work of registering the workflow. We need to create this workflow object from the LittleHorse SDK. And the name of the workflow is going to be IT request. And the thread func that implements the workflow logic is going to be the workflow logic function. So now how are we going to register the workflow? Well, workflow.register workflow spec with the client, and then we're done. This object right here returns void. So at that point, when we call this register workflow spec method from the main function, we will have a workflow registered with whatever logic we put in here. Now let's go back over to our main application, and we will. Well, we don't want to do that. We just need to remove the print line. What we're going to do over here is create an IT request workflow object. And we're going to register the workflow. Okay. So the last thing we have to do before we can actually run the workflow is define it. Now, remember, going back here, workflow starts with the user or employee submitting a request for an IT with an item, a justification, and also an email, which is their who identifies their identity. And then finance team is going to approve or reject it, and then we're going to notify the user when their request is accepted or not. So we're going to want to create a couple of variables because you know, it seems like there's a lot of variables going on, like the email, the item, the justification, and then later on whether it's approved. We might want to take care of status and so on. So first thing we're going to do is define some input variables. So you'll see here, this email input variable is the email of the person making the request. It is a string and it's required as an input. And we're also going to make it searchable so that you can search for workflows based on the email. That will be very useful when we're building the REST API. Next, we're going to make the item variable, which is going to look very similar to the email one. It's going to be a string. It's going to be required as input, and we're not going to make it searchable because I don't think you'd put an index on that column in a database, so we don't need to put an index on it in LittleHorse. And next up is going to be justification, which is why the user is requesting this item from IT. So these all have the .required method called on them, which means that they're required as input to run the workflow. So if you try to run the workflow and don't provide any of those variables, it will fail. Also, if you provide it with the wrong type, it will fail as well. So what we need to do now is we need to execute a user task. And we want to assign the user task to the finance user group, and we're not going to assign it to any particular user in particular. We don't necessarily need to use that feature for such a simple workflow. So I'm just going to make it very explicit by using extra variables with their names to show what's going on. And we're going to have the workflow assign a user task to the finance group. And the name of the user task is going to be approve IT request, which is that awesome user task definition that we created a couple seconds ago. So there's a couple other things I want to do here, which is I want the person executing this user task to know what they're approving, right? So what we should probably do is use the with notes feature of the user task. And we're going to put in a format string. And a format string basically means we're going to create a string and we're going to template in some variables to explain what's going on. So we have these variables, we can template them in using the workflow.format. And what do we want to format is the format is going to be user is requesting item justification. All right, so now we have created the template and we just need to put in the email, item, and justification values, which will template out that placeholder, that one, and that one respectively. Okay, so now we have assigned the user task. What we need to do is we need to save the results somehow so that we can continue on in the workflow and either approve or reject the request. Okay, how are we going to do that? This assign user task thing gives us this user task output object. Well, trying to make it look pretty. I'm not doing a very good job. I probably should have installed a code formatter. All right, you know what? This is okay. You guys can read that. Okay, so it looks like we need a couple more variables in our workflow. These aren't going to be input variables, but they're still going to be variables. We need to know whether it was approved, and we also need to know whether the we also need to know if there are any comments so that we can explain if in the case of the request being rejected, we need to be able to explain to the requester why their request was rejected. So let's do that really quickly. We're going to add 2 more variables, and eventually we're going to add 1 more, but for now we're just adding 2 more variables. This first variable is going to be a Boolean called isApproved. And it's not going to be an input variable. It's going to be it's going to be just a Boolean that is used internally as part of a workflow. And then next we're going to have a variable called comments, which are the comments from the reviewer of the request. And basically, if you look here, you'll note that we have 2 fields that pretty much mirror exactly the 2 fields that we have in this IT request. So we're going to use LittleHorse variable mutations to pull the results of this user task form, which is a user executing a user task, and put them into these workflow variables. So what we need to do right now is use the workflow.mutate method. And we're going to mutate is approved first. And we're going to assign it. And we're going to assign it to approval.json path is approved. And note that this field name comes from the field name on the user task definition, which by using the user task schema object over in main.java, by using this user task schema object, it just basically uses reflection to determine the field names by looking at the actual Java object. So now we know whether it's approved, and we also want to take a look at the comments. And I'm going to use the comments path here. So at this point, we now have a workflow which we can run. It's going to be a runnable workflow, and we can run it right now to test it, or we can go all the way and just test it at the end. But I think it'd be smarter to test right now, given that this is live coding. So what we can do, what we should expect is we should expect that we have a workflow specification that we can run, which will take in 3 variables. And then it will assign a user task to the finance team. And then when the finance team executes the user task, we should be able to see the results of the form that they put in saved into the variables of the workflow. So let's do that. What I'm going to do here is Gradle run, which should register the workflow specification again. Well, there is no complaints, so go back home, and now we have a workflow. And there is just one task, which is this user task, which has notes. It's assigned to the finance team. And we can see here that on this edge, we are mutating two variables and we're assigning it to this JSON path. So great. Let's run the workflow. Now note, I'm not passing in any variables, and we have some required variables into this workflow specification. Great. LittleHorse complains that we must provide the required input variable item for type string. Okay, so the email is going to be colts@littlehorse.io. Please, telemarketers, don't use that. And then the item is going to be lightsaber. And the justification is going to be, I don't know, I want to be a Jedi. Okay, so now we have run the workflow. And we're going to look for workflows that are in the running status. Using the LittleHorse command line to search. And we see right here, we have this workflow in the running status, which is the one that we just ran. However, if you don't like command line, you can see it on the dashboard, and you'll see it's running, it's not starting, it's not completed, it is running. Click here, and we're on this user task right now. Oh, look, there's notes. Colt is requesting the item lightsaber because he wants to be a Jedi. Amazing. So we'll inspect the user task run. Here's the user task good. But I think to talk about user tasks in LittleHorse, right now this user task is assigned to a group called finance. You can find user tasks based on who they're assigned to, based on their status, based on their type, using search user task run, RPC. And there's a command line utility for that as well. So I'll show you how to do that on the command line. In the next video, we're going to show you how you can do it programmatically in an API to build sort of these dashboards that allow you to interact with user tasks. Another cool thing that we have coming from LittleHorse Enterprises, not LittleHorse open source, unfortunately. LittleHorse Enterprises is soon going to release a product that allows you to connect with your identity provider like Okta or Auth0 or Keycloak, and automatically have a dashboard that presents all of the user tasks to you based on your identity token, and allow you to execute user tasks without writing any code specifically for that. So in that case, you'd be able to build this workflow just with using your notification team's email task run, which is already existing, and that dashboard with no code required at all, which would be really, really cool. However, we're going to go back to LittleHorse open source for a second, and how would you find this user task run? We're going to look for user group, user tasks assigned to the finance group. And in the status, unassigned. So here's a user task run. User task has two parts to the ID. One is the workflow run ID, and the other is the user task GUID. That's because every user task run belongs to a workflow run. So let's execute this user task run. There's a command line utility in LittleHorse command line to do this. You'd never use this in production, really. It's just for demo purposes. In production, what you would do is you'd have a REST API that makes a call to LittleHorse to execute the user task run. And that's what we'll do in the next video. But for now, for demo purposes, we're going to execute the user task run by hand on the command line. So notes, user Colt is requesting in the lightsaber, justification wants to be a Jedi. That's all expected. Let's just say that Obi-Wan is in charge of this request. I'm going to reject this request. And the reason why is Colt does not have force sensitivity. And it's going to be false. Okay, so now we go back to the workflow, and the user task run has been completed. We see here that Colt is not force sensitive, and that is false. So we also can look at the output of the user task run. We can see that it was at this point exactly set to Obi-Wan or assigned to Obi-Wan. We can see who completed the user task run. on the dashboard, which is actually quite useful. If you were using this for IT requests, you could actually use the LittleHorse dashboard for auditing if necessary. But anyways, I promised that the workflow would be working, and it's working so far. But now we need to act on this information. What we need to do is we need to use the send email task to tell someone, tell Colt whether or not his request was accepted or not. So we're going to use LittleHorse conditionals based on the value of this is approved variable. And we're going to either send an email saying your request was accepted or your request was rejected. So we're going to use the do if else thing. And this takes in 3 arguments. It takes in a condition, and it takes in an if else body, and it takes in another if else body. So basically, if the condition is true, then this first argument is executed, else the second argument is executed. So let's do it this way. Workflow.condition, and we're going to take in is approved comparator dot equals and true. So if is approved is true, we're going to do this. Else, we're going to do this. Okay, so now you see this is the Lambda function, and it takes in this workflow thread. At this point, it's illegal to use the WF handle of the workflow thread because we're technically in a different thread of execution in a different scope, right? So we're going to use the if body, not the WF. For more information, you can check the docs on conditional branching and the workflow spec, which I'll put in the show notes. Sorry, this is not a podcast. I've listened to too many podcasts where they say the show notes, but I'll put it in the video description. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do only one thing in this if body, right? We're going to execute, and the task def that we want to execute is send email, which if you recall, we have already created in the, we already have running. We have this send email task definition where there's a task worker already running and polling for it. We're going to execute send email, and it takes in, I forget what arguments it has. To address, subject, and body. I probably could have guessed that, especially given that I wrote the code like a month ago. So we're going to send it to the requester email, and then we're going to specify the subject is IT request approved, and then we're going to pass in a body, and we can use a format string again. So we're going to say email body equals if body.format. And we're going to pass in a couple arguments, such as your request for item was approved. And we're going to pass in item. Okay, great. So now we can see here we're executing the email task with that parameter in the case of accepted. Now, in the case of rejection, we're going to tell the customer that, or the user, that their request was rejected and why. And we're going to pass in the comments as well. Else body to execute email IT request rejected, and that email body. So you can see here, if it is approved, we're going to tell them that their request was approved. And, in real life, to do, maybe place an order on Amazon for the item or something like that. Like maybe you could automate the process of provisioning the item. That's beyond the scope of this demo. But in the case of rejecting it, we don't need to do anything else. Now, there's one last thing I want to do, which is, given that we're going to be in the next video creating a REST API on top of this approval workflow, what we want to do is we want to have a variable called status, which we can search in order to track all of these requests, because we want to build an API that allows you to find all the pending requests and so on and so forth, and maybe go back in the past and find all rejected requests or so on and so forth. So we're going to add one more variable. Now, in LittleHorse, you can either provide a variable type enum, or you can actually give it a default value. And the default value is what it starts as. And the status is going to be pending when it starts. And we're going to make it searchable because we want to be able to search for workflows based on their status. And you'll see on the dashboard how you can search for workflows based on their status as well, right? So let's take a quick look at this, right? So in the if handler, when the request is approved, we want to mutate the status to approved, right? Okay, and then in the case of rejection, we want to make the status rejected. All right, so you notice that this status variable isn't actually going to affect the workflow execution at all. All it's going to do is make it easier to find workflows based on their status and kind of build out like an API on top of it. That's for the next video, but I'll show you some cool stuff that you can do within the dashboard. So we have this task worker running for sending emails, and we have an old version of the workflow. What we want to do is we want to register a new version of the workflow and compare the two, and then we'll run it. So I'm going to run I'm going to do greater run again, which will run this main class right here, which we'll call workflow generator.register workflow spec. And it's going to create a new version of the workflow probably. So go back to the dashboard, we can see we have a new version of the workflow. Instead of V0, it's V1. The reason why we made a major version change is because we changed some of the searchable variables on it. So let's take a look at this. Well, now this workflow is a little bit more complicated. We can see if is approved is true. We send email with this information. Otherwise, we send email with this information. Your item was rejected. Great. This is actually a more impressive looking workflow specification. So it's pretty fun. And we can see we have extra variables as well. At this point, we will run the workflow with the same, well, actually, let's do it with a little bit different. I think asking for a lightsaber is pretty ridiculous. So we're not going to ask for a lightsaber. And why don't we use a different email, Colt plus demo at LittleHorse.io. Item, maybe I'll ask for a laptop. And I think I need a new laptop because I've had this for about 2 years. And every time I do anything more complicated than just writing in a text editor, my CPU fan sounds like it's about to explode. So I'm going to say I need a new laptop because my CPU runs really, really hot. So run the workflow. Go back to the dashboard. We can see we have a workflow for this workflow spec that we just ran in the running status, and it's right here waiting for someone to execute the user task. We can spend a long time talking about all the features of user tasks. I think that's beyond the scope of just this one video. So we're just going to go quickly execute the user task. I'm going to look for unassigned tasks assigned to the finance user group. If we don't have the unassigned status, we look, if we don't have the unassigned status and we look for the user tasks that are belonging to the finance group, we see both of them, including the one that we already completed. But here's the one that's in the unassigned status, which means it's not done. If we look for task status done, we can find the one that has been already completed. So let's execute the task that we want to execute. So LHCTL execute, user task run. Oh, sorry. As you can tell, this is 100% unscripted, I promise. So I wanted to show you how you can go to the workflow specification and you can search for workflows by variable right now. So we're going to look for Colt plus Jedi at LittleHorse.io. Nothing found. However, if you look for Colt demo, you can find this particular workflow run, right? But more importantly, if we want to look at the status, we want to look for workflows that are in the pending status, we find this workflow right here. If you look for approved, we don't find anything yet. So what we want to do is execute this user task run and make the workflow go to approved, because I think a laptop is a little bit more reasonable than a lightsaber of a request, which makes me very sad. We all want lightsabers. Oh, wait, sorry, this is the wrong one. As you can tell, completely unscripted. We got the problem user task already in terminated state because I tried to execute the one from the other workflow. So now I think I think someone is going to be executing this user task run, and I've never met this person. I think one person I really respect is Jun Rao, who is the co-founder of Confluent and creator of Kafka. I think he would approve a request for a laptop. Laptops help write Apache Kafka code. Is it approved? Yes, it is going to be approved. So then we go back to the workflow. We go back to the dashboard. We look here, and this workflow is now approved, and we see that it took this path. I actually just got an email, which is what we would hope. I'll show you the email in a second. But successfully sent email to colt+demo@littlehorse.io. But the cool thing is now we look at the search by variable. We search for variables by status. We go for approved. And we find this one. We find pending, no data. Which means that we now have the ability to find workflows and stuff by their status, manage them through the command line, and run workflows through the command line. That's useful, but we can go a step further and we can build a REST API on top of it. I think perhaps building a UI is not related enough to LittleHorse to be worth the time on LittleHorse YouTube channel, but maybe we'll do that at some point in the future. What remains to do is I need to show you the email just for fun. And you can see here, I got an email from SendGrid saying your request for laptop was approved. So there we have it. This concludes our first tutorial in this multi-part series. Next video, we're going to create a REST API on top of this workflow that we built.